Today, I'm joined by Charlie Peters. He is a writer and broadcaster from London, and he is also a documentary filmmaker for GB News. Welcome, Charlie.
Good morning. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I've had the strange pleasure of recently seeing your latest documentary called "Grooming Gangs: Britain's Shame," which I guess, as the title implies, is not very pleasant viewing, but it's very informative, and it relates to something that I was vaguely aware of even when I was living in the UK, which was about now maybe like 4, 5, 6 years ago. It was kind of in the ether, and it was kind of associated with some, nefarious characters such as Tommy Robinson, who was pretty much the only person who was kind of out and loud and talking about this stuff. So I wonder, I mean, you've now taken it upon yourself to become, in a way, the face of this thing, or not necessarily the face, but to be kind of the catalyst to bring the story out in full, and to present the scale of everything that's happened. So I wonder how this has been for you. I mean, to become associated with this thing, which, like I said, Tommy Robinson had to pay quite a high price to be engaged with.
I'd say for me, the price that I'm paying for engaging with this topic pales in comparison to the price paid by the survivors and those involved in the story that I'm speaking to. So, to be honest with you, I don't think of it very much. I think there are elements of physical and moral courage attached to this work, as there is with all good investigative journalism. But no, I have to say I'm almost embarrassed to answer this kind of question, and it has been asked before, because obviously the people I'm meeting and speaking to and working with on these stories have endured so much that to compare the disapproving glances from journalists who don't like the story, or the mutterings of people in my friendship groups who perhaps don't agree with my analysis or the policy proposals I make. I mean, that as a cost really is negligible in comparison to what I have witnessed and what I have recorded. So, in all honesty, I'm very happy to take on the mantle of this story, because I think, and I suppose the motivating factor for me for making this film was that when the lid blew off this scandal over a decade ago in the Times newspaper, I felt like we never really had the honest and accurate conversation from all parts of society. So the media pretty much bottled it extensively across the papers and the broadcasters. I think that government was diabolical in its dealing with this issue. The reports it published into the national picture have been lame in the extreme. They have not had the sufficient analysis required. And that has allowed those who would rather ignore this topic and pretend it doesn't exist for it to disappear. And they are happy to do that because I think this story exposes so many of Britain's social ills and struggles across the board that to ignore it allows people who are either active architects of those failures or are complicit through their inaction to escape the robust criticism they deserve. Now, for any of your viewers and listeners who don't really know,
Yes, that was my next question. Yeah, and
yeah,
I think
sorry, I just
people know,
realized I'm
just
wrapping.
tangentially know about this, I think, because I've mentioned this before on the
Sure.
podcast if they listen to my whole opus. But it's a little bit common knowledge, kind of in the more right wing sphere. But if you could just lay out not only what it is and kind of what you found about the scale of it, and kind of how it's playing out, maybe even today.
Sure. So it's called the so-called kind of grooming gang scandal. Grooming gangs refers to group localized child sexual exploitation under what is often known as the boyfriend model of exploitation, whereby victims are treated with fake and false compassion by their abusers. They are groomed into believing they're in a relationship often, and then they are systematically abused, tortured, raped, all the rest of it. Horrific. This story and this trend relates to instances of group localized child sexual exploitation that have additional crises and I would say sociological issues and tags attached to them, insofar as the victims are mostly white, They're mostly not even considered working class girls by much of society. They're kind of considered underclass, often from broken homes, often living in care, really just not considered important by many people. And the perpetrators in this kind of abuse are, the overrepresentation is vastly in line with South Asian and particular Pakistani men in Britain. So, as you can imagine, this story has attracted ire from all sides, but it has attracted the rage, condemnation, and interest predominantly from the right, and then I would say a significant amount of awkward silence from the left, for reasons I touched on before. And so this story really came to light massively at a national level in 2012, when a reporter at the Times called Andrew Norfolk published a series of stories in and from Rotherham, which is a post-industrial Victorian town in South Yorkshire in the north of England, where he said that street grooming and the abuse of girls was going on. This is 2012. The local council dismissed his reporting as lies of the Murdoch press, the Times newspaper owned by News UK, owned by Rupert Murdoch, considered obviously like an enemy of the left and all the rest of it. So it was dismissed. And then in 2014, after significant pressure, lots of reporting by this excellent journalist, Mr. Norfolk, a review was published into the town called the J Report, which found that 1,400 girls had been abused in the town from 1997 to 2013. But this is a small town, it's very low, six figures population. So for 1,400 girls to be systematically groomed and abused in that period is seismic. It's been described as the worst child abuse scandal in modern Europe this century. And I think it's the most shocking story of the Elizabethan era in Britain. But the real scandal lies in the fact that this is a national story. It is not just Rotherham. And so my work has been trying to investigate to what extent it is still going on today and where else it has occurred. Now, pockets of stories have picked up throughout the country since 2014. So we've had a huge crisis in Rochdale, which is in Lancashire and Greater Manchester. Another in Telford, which is on the border with Wales, so a little bit further south. And then there have been, up to 50 different towns and cities where credible reports of these grooming gangs have taken place, where the trend is similar. So majority Asian, Pakistani, or Muslim men, and then majority white working class girls as the victims, as the survivors. And so this is a national story, and all too often, I think people have been keen to paint it as an isolated or specific area related to the nighttime economy. Actually, I think, and the reason why I was so keen to make this film was to impart the analysis that this is a cultural, racial issue. This comes from a position of this is a hate crime in the extreme. And it is not just about access, it's not just about taxis and kebab shops and people working and having access to drunk girls or whatever. This is about a specific motivated crime of hate against defenseless victims. So a big part of that story as well, on top of the motivations of the abusers, has been looking at to what extent the authorities sworn to protect those survivors were negligent in the extreme, or in some cases actively involved in covering up the crimes of those they were sworn to deal with. So in Rotherham, for example, we now know that South Yorkshire Police, the local police force, failed in the extreme. There were 91 investigations against 47 officers in an operation by the Independent Office for Police Conduct. They found examples of police officers finding girls in the back of taxis being abused by men and just moving on. Parents of some girls who were being abused were told that it would, this was part of growing up. It would teach them a lesson. They, in one extraordinary case, we had an example of a taxi driver facilitating the handover, the exchange of a kidnapped and abused girl to the police via her abuser. So he facilitated a handover deal in which the abuser would get off without being punished and the girl would be returned to her family. And, it's just extraordinary levels of conspiracy and toxic cover-up culture. And it was rife. And that was just Rotherham, but similar experiences occurred in Rochdale in particular, where the local police were found to be vastly incompetent. Same was true in Telford, another one of the towns I feature in the film. And we can be almost certain that the failures and the modes of feeling and thought that afflicted these authorities has been replicated in that 50 different other towns that I mentioned. And of course, the motivating factor behind all of that failure, the real fear that drove them away from action, the shameful kind of crisis that prevented them from doing something, was the overarching fear that prosecuting majority Asian Pakistani gangs would be seen as racist, that it would lead to some sort of punishment for them, or it would reveal a truth that they didn't want to face. And so this abuse was just allowed to continue. And that is the rank truth of it.
Yes, I think the strangest and most disturbing part of the reaction that I've read about and I saw in your documentary was kind of the systematic victim blaming that the police engaged in with the young girls. And I mean, these are girls. I mean, some are 11, 12 years old. It's almost inconceivable that you could even ascribe any sort of kind of sexual agency to them. Yet, a lot of this stuff was just considered, I don't know, ladies of the night doing different activities and essentially kind of prostitution. But just even inhabiting this lens is just feels um, not even I don't know. It's inconceivable, and this is happening in the UK police force, who is um, known for excesses of political correctness in so many other ways. And I wonder. I mean, there's obviously a class implication here. Like you said, these girls were essentially forgotten in many ways, or people weren't as interested in them as other classes of white girls. But there's obviously kind of a misogyny implication here as well. I mean, the idea that if there's, I guess, I don't know, some consensual element to this. Yeah, I mean, how much do you think that is just them trying to find the most plausible explanation to not actually start a local race war? Or did you consider that this is actually what they believed?
I think in some cases there, the prioritization of community cohesion and social cohesion and calmness between multiracial, multicultural towns overwhelmingly prioritized the keenness to protect girls who were being abused. In Oldham, for example, a town that I visited as part of the investigation, there were huge race riots in 2001. People were stabbed, pubs were raided. It was ethnic violence in the north of England, remarkable. And so I think that nervousness must have played on the minds of police officers just 50 miles away in different towns, thinking, okay, if we admit that we have a massive scandal whereby Asian men are targeting white girls in systematic child abuse, torture, rape, in some cases murder, are we risking reigniting those flames? And so I think it's almost certainly the case that fear was at the forefront of the thinking of senior police officers and social services as they carried out their own investigation into these scenarios. And they have to have known as well, because as you can imagine, the local social services, some of them were diabolical in their failure to deal with these issues. The stories from Rotherham are, social workers losing files. If girls became pregnant and they were removed from care, they were deemed, if you got pregnant, then you're obviously choosing to have sex, then you can't possibly have been coerced or raped. But there were some social workers, some heroes, and you meet them in the film, who did report this stuff and did bring this to the attention of senior officials who would have looked the other way. And I think it's almost certainly the case that that fear, that community cohesion preference, was at the forefront of it. Now, as part of kind of investigations attached to the film and research I've done and kind of digging I've done around this broadcast, I investigated a man called Maruf Hussain, who was the community cohesion minister for Rotherham at the height of this scandal. And in a report in 2015, he was accused of covering up this issue by virtue of pushing conversations away from when police officers raised concerns, he would diminish them. He accused a fellow Labour Party member of being racist. He made a false allegation of racism when they raised this concern. And I think he also kind of stood up for taxi drivers when the police wanted to investigate the overrepresentation of taxi drivers in this kind of child abuse. So he was involved in some way of reducing the focus on this issue at the highest level of the local government. So he had to resign when the report was published. He resigned in disgrace. But 8 years later, I found that he'd snuck back into the public sector and was working in the National Health Service as a national diversity, inclusion, and participation manager. So a man who had prioritized community cohesion over a frank and direct, and I was alleged to have, prioritized this over a direct investigation into the issue, was suddenly running diversity programs for the health service, which I think, that cuts right into the heart of the toxic, evil, kind of, extreme left, wokeist perspective that runs to the heart of this crisis, whereby, if crimes are committed by certain races against other certain classes, then they must be ignored. They must be looked away. We must pretend that they don't happen. For that person to then work in diversity, I think it cuts the very heart of the sickness at the core of that mode of thinking, where you rank races, where you rank abuse, where who is acceptable to be abused, who is not. And yes, the investigation into his hiring is ongoing by the NHS as a result of my reporting. So we will find out what they do with him soon. But they were unaware; they had no idea.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, there's so many ways to reinvent yourself in the public sector, and I think this is not the only case of people trying to escape association with this kind of hive of crimes, and then reappear and reinvented or kind of cleansed form somewhere else. There's an infinity of jobs for people who have the specialization of being very well implanted into certain communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he, actually in that intervening period between resigning in disgrace from the council and working for the NHS as a diversity manager, he rebranded himself as an anti-Islamophobia activist. It's so kind of blatant and so direct that after leaving a council which was so nervous and riddled with anxiety over being seen to be targeting Muslim Pakistani men, that he would then move into that kind of space afterwards as a sort of professional consultant. He worked for a charity called Faith Matters. He did work with Tell Mama UK, the charity that leads the conversation on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, etc. So I think it's very telling that he used that bridge to move on to his next career. In fact, I found an example of him giving a lecture to West Yorkshire Police on diversity. The West Yorkshire Police, obviously a different force to the one that he worked with at South Yorkshire. But here's a man who stands accused in a publicly printed report commissioned by the government of telling a police officer not to investigate sufficiently Pakistani taxi drivers who are abusing girls. Years later, being hired by a different police force to lecture them on diversity. Like it's a sham. Like it's a total sham. It disgraces us. And yet, while I'm always delighted to get an exclusive and a scoop, I was like appalled by the fact that I had found this and nobody else had. And this is my first attempt at an investigative documentary, and like it was just there, sat in the open, and nobody else had bothered to look into it. I felt like, and the lack of accountability, I think, really lies at the heart of this crisis. So many people have been involved either actively or have been complicit in this crisis and just have been able to move on with their lives. In some ways, they've been promoted. Britain is a country that loves to promote generals who lose wars, but this is a new level of promotion amid failure. I mean, this is grievous disaster in a public office. And someone who ran children's services at Rotherham, went on to work for a charity, got a 6-figure payout. Instances like that, and police officers, senior constables, chief, assistant chief constables, just adding more pips and crowns to their collars as they become more senior after overseeing this sort of failure. In fact, another kind of scoop we landed in this investigation was about a Labour politician also from the time of Maruf Hussain. He had to resign in 2015. He was called Dominic Beck. He was then the deputy leader of the council, I think. And he had to resign. Sorry, he wasn't a deputy leader. He was a minister, though. He had to resign in 2015 when this report came out, detailing that the council was in denial about the extent of the problem. And as a minister in the council and in the cabinet, he had responsibility for the institutional culture. 7 years later, he was picked by Labour to become the parliamentary candidate for Rother Valley, the seat that runs over Rotherham. So he was a man who was deemed to have some shared responsibility for the culture of ignorance and denial that was in the council. 7 years later, that same Labour Party is picking him to run as its representative to Westminster, the highest seat of power in Britain. And the reason that has been able to happen is it's core to that lack of accountability I was talking about. So many of the Labour activists and politicians and local figures from that time still have red rosettes on their chest, still are campaigning for the Labour Party, still have positions of influence. I can keep going if you want, but there was a big story I dropped in February as well about this group of people who were around at the time and are still there. So Jane Senior, who's the social worker in my film from Rotherham, my main source in Rotherham, she was at a meeting in 2005 where her council-funded youth project called Risky Business delivered a lecture, a seminar to every single councillor who was in Rotherham Council at the time. So this seminar briefed 31 Labour councillors, I believe, and some other independent and opposition councillors too. But at the time, it was a Labour-dominated council, massively. Now less so, but still they're in charge. And they were taken through a case study of a girl who'd been systematically abused, groomed, tortured, had been, violence against her mother, violence against her family. They'd been forced to move, all the rest of it. Horrific uprooting of her life, out of school. Her life was just a constant barrage of abuse. And yet, the councillors did nothing. In fact, the minutes of that meeting were just short. Nobody did anything about it. And they claimed, some of the councillors at the time claimed that they said and did nothing because the police said it would jeopardise their own inquiries. It would prevent them from going after these men. And this case study was one of hundreds that was briefed. So they were showing this was a crisis, a widespread crisis in this small town. And they were just able to get away with saying that the reason why they had done nothing was because the police were doing this when news of this seminar came out in 2014. But nobody had bothered to really press them on this. So I looked into it. I found no evidence that the police were even at the meeting. And the first police investigation into this abuse in the town started in 2008 and didn't secure any convictions until 2010. So this claim that the police shut them up is first, very unlikely due to the fact that the police weren't there, as far as I can tell. And secondly, they were silent for 3 years while the police did nothing. At no point did they chase the police, and the council and the police are in a regular conversation, they work together all the time. At no point did they go to the police and say, what's the latest on dealing with this horrific abuse we were all briefed on for an hour and a bit? What's going on? So 5 years passed before there were any convictions. 5 years. And that was called Operation Central, that police operation. And everyone thought Operation Central would lead to more convictions, another one. But that was it. They did one and that was that. And that allowed the abusers to keep getting away with it. 4 of those councillors who were at that meeting in 2005 are still serving on Rotherham's council. One of them chairs the ethics committee on the council. You know, one of them chairs a committee called Improving Places, about making the town safer. You know, all of them failed drastically, I believe, in dealing with this crisis in 2005. And I've tried very hard to, raise the alarm on this issue, and the story did very well, but nobody else picked up on it really, and they're still in power. In fact, one
Yeah.
of the men I spoke to, a man called Alan Atkin, he was a councillor. It's a fairly grotesque figure, if I can speak out of turn for a moment. When I asked him, why didn't you do anything in 2005 when you were told this? Why didn't you speak up? He said, I was just getting on with my life. I was just getting on with things. That's what he said. And when I
Yeah.
brought this story, to my editor, and they said, are you sure he actually said that? I had to play them the recording to prove them that he did actually say that. Because it's so stunning a statement to just admit, I was just getting on with my life, after being told that dozens, possibly hundreds, in reality thousands of girls were being abused. And that was that.
Yeah. That was kind of my, I think the most startling impression I got just by, just living in the UK myself. Obviously, I didn't have any tangent with the scandal itself, but there seemed to be a way in which the UK is probably the most kind of anarcho-tyrannical place that I've visited, especially the police force, because the scale at which law-abiding citizens can be prosecuted for minor infractions
Mhm.
that go against the mainstream regime is insane. Like, people jailed for online speech, for sharing memes, for things like that. And on the other hand, obviously you have these extremes, but just living, it seemed like that the police, their most important role was when actual violent crime, systematic violent crime was happening. Because I used to live in East London, and that was a common occurrence.
Yes.
They would come and they would maybe make a little report. They would write it down somewhere, and it would be, I don't know, put into some form of record, and then they would leave. And this would be anything from, stabbings around I'm sure some form of investigation would happen, but you'd never hear any sort of result from that.
Mm.
It seemed like, okay, what is the core mandate of the police force of the United Kingdom is keeping a lid on racial and diversity issues. That was pretty much that. If you think about what their role is as that, then you see that they're actually a pretty decent police force. They're doing that, to a fault. And they know the only people who they are able to actually prosecute in this context are the law abiding people, mostly British or mostly, from whatever Western Europe coming there. And yeah, it seemed not only insane, but also completely unsustainable. Like, I mean, the crime literally drove me out of London. And, I'm not the only person. Like, I know people, living in nice places like Islington, just, having, you know, being beaten up in the street for the crime of walking home at night, and it just absurd things. And what's the result of the police investigation? Absolutely nothing anytime. Like, the doors on our building, we had like a little bike storage downstairs. They looked like it was the bomb, like the door to a bomb shelter. Every night people tried to break in. They broke in a few times. Like, you could just at night you could just hear people trying to get into the building almost every night. And like, there was absolutely no limit to what could happen there, and absolutely no limit to how little the police cared. So I don't know. It's just I mean, how long can this go on?
So Peter Hitchens rather wonderfully once described British police as a paramilitary social workers force. So they exist to sort of be kind of quasi-armed, the owners of violence in the state who deal with minor societal crises and are kind of the gel that keeps the Blairite dream stuck together. Now, it's certainly true that the police have suffered enormously since 2010 with austerity. In London, for example, the number of actual police stations has plummeted. The number of police officers on the beat has also gone down significantly. So they are dealing with a massive resource crisis. But at the same time, when we do give them resources, what do they focus on? Well, they're rather keen on investigating people who silently pray outside or near abortion clinics. They will arrest you if you tweet the wrong thing about transgenderism. They use the 2003 Communications Act to prosecute and bully those who use so-called grossly offensive speech. They will use the Public Order Act to do the same. WhatsApp jokes are now more liable for prosecution, I think, than bike theft and mobile phone theft. If you have your bike or your phone stolen in London, you might as well just pretend that it never happened. I would file a report purely just to get insurance, right, to claim it back, not because I have any hope that the police would get it for me. And I think that sort of quasi-lawless hopelessness that you and I might have felt at some point in London on a low level in terms of dealing with low-level violence or property theft, which is appalling and drives people out, as it did for you, pales in comparison to the kind of level of utter hopelessness that would have afflicted these girls across the country, who must have thought at the time, and in many cases I'm sure still do, think, why was I so wrong to not be protected? Like, what have I done wrong to have been failed so severely? Like, what about my identity, about my person, about my life choices means that you really are ignoring me? I know that the reason why kind of peers of mine in London are ignored is partially due to resources, partially because the police don't like confronting the bulk majority of people who commit, theft and violent crime in London in some cases. But for them, I mean, it must be just like an unbearable realization that the police literally do not care about you at all, and in some cases were actively involved in supporting your abusers. Like, one of the cases in the film I cover is about a girl who finally gathered the courage to speak to the police and was taken there by a researcher who'd been brought up to the town in Rotherham to investigate drug gangs. But actually she found these grooming gangs. And she, in the period of her investigation, she worked with social workers and gained the trust of one girl who was at the core of a ring of abuse, a horrifyingly vast network of abuse. It took her months to gain the trust. And when she went to the police station, she got a message on her phone from her abuser saying, "I know you're there. I know you're at the police station." So this man, this abuser, had already broken her brother's legs and told her that he had her 11-year-old sister, that I have your sister with me right now. Basically threatening her that, if you don't leave now, worse things will happen to you and your family. The most unbearable pressure for a young teenage girl to feel. So, shock, she left. She felt quite rightly that the police could not protect her. And nobody can ever blame her for making that decision, because God only knows what would have happened if she'd stayed. How the abuser found out that she was in the police station has never, ever been explained. But we can draw some conclusions, can't we? We can use a bit of deductive assessment to work out the likely causes of that. There's another man called PC Hassan Ali, who was put under investigation in 2015 due to his alleged links to the abusers. He was involved in the handover of the abused girl to the police that I mentioned earlier in this podcast. He was actually run over and killed on the day that it was announced that he was being investigated. Is that a coincidence? I think it's highly unlikely that it's not a coincidence. PC Hassan Ali probably knew a lot. He probably knew a lot of people who were involved in either actively covering this up or looking the other way. So he was, so possibly linked to the fact that he died on the very same day that the announcement into his investigation was made. So, to say that, the police failed these girls and did not commit to the duty that they are sworn to under the Crown is true as a grave understatement. And I think we still see replications of that in other parts of the law, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's also a strange situation now that a lot of people that have ties in the community, or maybe kind of active parts of the community, are now parts of the kind of the establishment as well. Like you said, constables are part of the wider Pakistani community. People in local administration. It's not necessarily obviously that people would side with tribal identities before the interests of society at large, but it seems to be the case that has happened, and it's
And
not unexpected either.
Oh yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. I mean, one of the reasons why I think this scandal was allowed to go on for so long as it did is because there is a particular overrepresentation of clannish attitudes among some immigrant communities in Britain, and Pakistani Brits in particular, where cousin marriage is very common. And so that creates a level of socio-biological kinship whereby there are links by blood to so many parts of the community that lives around you. Um, you know, cousin marriage is so common in some parts of Britain that it has led to crises within the health system whereby so many birth defects occur due to this problem. This is considered by many to be sort of unbearable, hateful reality, but it's true, and we should be able to speak about this, and we should also be dealing with it because first cousin marriage is not a good thing, and it's very unhealthy. It is very dangerous. So those clannish attitudes are generated in part by socio-biological kinship, but I think also by tools of extreme misogyny and threats of societal outcasting that exist within these communities. So the power imbalance between men and women in British Pakistani or Muslim communities in general is pretty severe, right? Even in many of these communities, if you don't exist within the same progress of the wider society, you don't catch on to the social mores and the moral values that are picked up by others, the customs that are picked up by others. And so lots of Pakistani girls were abused in Rotherham, but did not speak up for different reasons to the white victims. They didn't speak up because they feared that it would ruin their marriage prospects. I can't find a single case of a man being prosecuted and convicted for these crimes, being punished, returning, going to jail for like 3 or 4 years or whatever. Like they get pathetic jail sentences, returning home and then being outcast. They almost always, I can't find a single case. I'm trying very hard to find one. They almost always return to their family. They're not punished. They're not outcast because they have so much extreme power in the household that their wives can't leave because they have no independence. They have no work. They're not allowed to work. There is no freedom for women to stand up against the male abuser in the house on a level which I think is even worse than it happens when it happens to like indigenous Brits or like white Britons or when Western European couples have an abusive husband or an abusive partner. I think there is an added layer of punishment there insofar as they don't have the means to escape by virtue of the fact they have nowhere to go. So that has meant that lack of accountability within the community has been really severe, really severe. There are even stories of, white mums going up to the wives of abusers and saying, "Your husband is abusing my daughter. Please do something," because the police won't do anything. And the wives just like saying, "I can't do anything. I have just as little power as you in this situation." And their experiences have been, charted well, I think, by some other journalists, and that's been good to see, like the wives of the abusers being represented in this conversation. But I didn't have time for it in my documentary. But I think there's a really important part of the discussion, and I'm very keen to make this in any follow-up discussion because I think that cuts to the heart of that particular reason for why they were able to return to their families or their communities without punishment.
Yes, and you've touched a little bit on the motivations of the abusers. I mean, this kind of in in very broad terms, misogyny, essentially kind of a hate crime. But do you have any other insights about it seems like extremely pervasive, like you said, and just a proportion of girls who were raped in Rotherham alone, which is a small town, and the kind of the systematic way in which these networks worked, and the fact that pretty much everyone participated, at least as an accomplice, it really makes you wonder very much about the mental state because in kind of in a Western context, typically you think about okay sexual abuse as something a certain pathology, especially on minors, a certain pathology of of a like subsection of males who have this I don't know paraphilia and this tendency to do this. But here just the scale of it puts that whole theory into question. And I wonder
Yeah.
if you've found anything about this particular direction.
I'd say that what is a common thread among most of these stories is the keenness to depict girls as deserving of the abuse. So the racial aspects cannot be ignored. Stories in Rotherham and Rochdale, in particular, described white girls being passed around by groups of men in a ball, like tossed around, and the men saying that degrading her as I don't want to repeat the language they use, but just like heavily racialized terms to describe them in misogynistic ways. So there is that element, which is also borne out in the punishment aspect. So when one of the Rochdale gangs, about the only Rochdale gang that was taken to court, and the lead defendant in that trial said he objected to being tried by an all-white jury. So clearly, the racial element, the ethnic element, was like vital to understanding this crisis, both in the perpetrating of the crime and in the kind of reaction during the criminal justice process. And then also, I just think, like, if you allow violent and stupid, simple men the freedom to access sex without punishment, and they have a predilection for sexual violence, and they get away with it once, then I think the serotonin feedback loop kicks in, that they can just keep doing this evil thing and they will get away with it, and they will keep going, and that will grow and grow and grow until you get some of the horrifying situations that we've seen.
Yes.
The first instance is horrifying, but the massive instance of it is catastrophic. Also, I think in the 1970s, there was a conflict, Bangladeshi liberation war and independence war in Bangladesh. Pakistanis and Bangladeshis fought very heavily, where rape was a common weapon, as common as the bullet. Hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi women were raped during that conflict, and many of the men in that conflict, would have had rape as a cultural practice. I think that shows a certain level of, preference to use rape as a tool of violence at a kind of low level. Like it's almost a reactive thing. It doesn't take much to jump to that preference. I think that was way more common in that conflict than others in the 70s or in that period, and that many of those kind of cultures have been brought to Britain reflects that concern. And the reason why I think an extremely backward, misogynistic, violent culture has been able to flourish without being punished in Britain so much, that it collided at the same time with a certain kind of open licentiousness within British culture, like lads, mags, hypersexualized culture. So you had like a hugely liberal or like uber progressive approach to sex among the white population that like completely, it was weird. It was like a weird shift in terms of hypersexualization from the 90s onwards. Porn everywhere, obviously. Like the biggest newspaper in the country had topless women on the inside of the first page. So that culture of like, oh, it's okay to be wild and be free and express your sexuality, colliding with an unspoken and unpunishable, visceral, violent, foreign male rage. Like it's just like the perfect collision for crisis. And lo and behold, crisis occurred.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I remember kind of, growing up in the 90s, even here, I mean, this is kind of an extension of the wider Anglosphere in a way. Um, the idea was that, once you were kind of generically teenage, you would just be kind of, let loose on the world, and, hopefully you don't die and things like that. So it was very much a change, a huge shift in the morals, and just maybe just what was seen as possible in terms of actual guiding of your children kind of fell away.
Yeah, and at the same time, I mean, it was weird. I mean, Britain in the Northeast was an extremely confused place. It's when I was growing up as well. I mean, there was at once a hypersexualized culture, but also an extremely punitive tabloid energy about like aggressively criticizing girls who engage in it. So there was a huge like teenage pregnancy scare at the same time as we were promoting a culture of promiscuity and a low openness and like a high openness and like easy access to sex. It's like they don't work together. And these two trends don't should not exist side by side. And so really, really punitive and almost like hyper conservative punishment of girls who engage in the culture that the same media promotes. So that that level of promotion of sexuality and punishment of these girls is another way in which they were ignored and treated as like making their own choices by so many of these police forces and local politicians at the time. And I think we're starting to see a reaction against many of those things. I mean, you yourself have spoken regularly about kind of the sex negative movement. You've had guests like that on your show. Do I think the same thing would happen today on the same scale? I'm really not so sure. I think we have a very suddenly very shifting attitude towards sexual culture and sexuality, especially with the Me Too movement and all that has brought with it. But we do know that this is still going on. Part of my investigation was establishing that so many girls are still being fobbed off by the police while they're being abused. So many police forces are still not recording ethnicity. The National Crime Agency, which is like Britain's FBI, was brought into Rotherham to keep investigating the issue after 2015 because South Yorkshire police clearly could not be trusted. They have found another 110 victims, and they've made dozens of more prosecutions, and they've notified, and they found loads more perpetrators. So this is still an issue. Many of the perpetrators have gotten away with it, and it won't change until the national conversation I'm trying to restart happens properly and fully. I think I've been successful in starting some reinvigorated conversation, but I want more.
Yes, and rightly so, because I think we can only intuit how many cases there are that haven't. I mean, this is a just famously hard to speak about type of crime, especially in the context of grooming, because essentially the grooming aspect is kind of the securing of some form of even light cooperation, at
Mm,
least in the beginning. We're using all
mm,
these essentially sales tactics to brainwash children to kind of go along with the incremental scale of abuse that you're subjecting them to up until the point where they don't really know what's happening, and then add to that the layer of the threats against family, the fact that this happens in small communities. Obviously, these people are aware of the family ties of the girls, and you mentioned in one of your pieces as well that there's kind of a strange kind of added layer of technology where these girls are stalked on Snapchat, and they're being sent pictures of their families and very targeted threats against them. So it's probably very very hard to actually estimate the scale of this, but just knowing the numbers that are already out there, and the proportion of pretty much all girls in Rotherham is the number of people abused is just absolutely horrendous. So I mean, yeah, this rabbit hole inevitably has to go much deeper.
yeah, and I'm staying on the story. So I've produced a year long investigation and a film, but some others will pick up on it, and there are already many journalists who are interested in this story. But I'm certainly not going to drop it myself. I'm very keen to keep investigating. In fact, one of my future projects will be, I think, a documentary dedicated entirely to the situation in Oldham, a town in Lancashire, also in Greater Manchester, which needs its own standalone investigation because the many characters and issues at play there are fascinating. But I mean, with regret, I expect more stories to develop in this space, and I will continue to pursue them.
Yeah, I think that's invaluable work, and I just I'm mourn the beautiful country that the UK is. I've immigrated to the UK at one point because I was just attracted by the infinity of culture pouring out of this obvious cradle of civilization, and
Mm.
we might complain on the show about the fallout of Anglo civilizational decline, but the fact that there even is a civilization at the core of this is all, the result of what the British people and, everyone who's worked there has developed. And it's really, I feel deep sadness for what's going on in the UK, and I really do hope that people, the indigenous population of Britain has a certain wake up moment about a lot of these things, because there is a certain, kind of go along to get along vibe in the UK. The wrongful implementation of the stiff upper lip. I think, it shouldn't be so stiff at the moment. It should be a little bit, um, you know, focused on the things that are really going wrong, because these things escalate, and they snowball up to a point where it's going to be very hard to move. I mean, obviously Brexit was a sort of popular revolt, but you see how even Brexit itself has been kind of torn and twisted and turned into something else, and it hasn't really yielded the actual results that people were looking for. But I wonder if you feel that there are other revolts bubbling under the surface, because this has to be part of one.
I would say that your commentary briefly on the British and in particular the English national psyche is very, yeah, very lucent, very true. The stiff upper lip energy, I think, is underrated. We need more of it, but unfortunately, it's applied in a sort of like mawkish and sentimental way when dealing with crises. The best example of this that I use regularly is the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, the Ariana Grande concert, where Salman Abedi, a Libyan so-called asylum seeker, carried out a suicide bombing at this concert, killed dozens of children. The national reaction and the national conversation that followed that event was ghoulish. It made me extremely distressed for the future of my country. And the overarching theme of that was an Oasis song, Don't Look Back in Anger. Oasis, obviously, huge band from Manchester, the biggest band from England, I would say, since the Beatles, right? And Don't Look Back in Anger being used as the commentary after dozens of children were pulling the flesh of their friends out of their ears and their hair, after their limbs were ripped from them and they were massacred by a man who should not have been in the country. A man who was rescued by the Royal Navy, brought to England, given a home, given everything that the riches and bounty of Britain can offer. And his response and his way of repaying that kindness and that foolish, naive generosity was to kill our children. Don't look back in anger. Goodness me. I mean, I was looking back in all sorts of rage. And it distressed me enormously to realize that the prevailing sentiment was don't look back in anger. And I keep thinking about that instance when I think about this story as well. The prioritization of social cohesion among disparate and indeed often actively confrontational groups that cannot really exist successfully side by side, trying to generate a sort of fake homogeneity through values that don't really mean anything. Since the Blairite moment in the late 90s, British values have come to mean these kind of wishy-washy, woolly, fake concepts like tolerance, diversity, values that actually don't mean anything in terms of Britishness. These are just universal concepts of liberalism and progressivism. But if you ask the average Briton, what are British values? They will say tolerance and diversity, because that is what's been drummed into their heads for the best part of 3 decades. And so when these horrifying events happen, the first, alarm bell that goes off in their heads is, well, let's be tolerant and let's pursue the protection of diversity. No, let's absolutely not be tolerant and pursue the protection of diversity. If it leads to these kind of scenarios, we should ask ourselves, what are the political policy and societal levers that have been pulled that have led to these kind of catastrophes occurring? Because there are so many, and you won't fix them if you don't look back in anger and if you don't look back with your brain. Clearly, a huge degree of analysis is required. Some tough thinking is needed, but the the population that would revolt is kind of diminished through very successful, very aggressive communications and political campaigns that seek to sort of numb their urges of anger. And I think this is very successfully coordinated by government and media. and the popular consciousness and the culture, it all whips up into generating this sort of massive amnesia and this almost kind of like general anesthetic for rage that should bubble up among people who feel as though their country is being torn to shreds by those who don't care for it. So, do I think there'll be a reaction there? Obviously, a lot of me hopes there is. Like, a lot needs to change to generate that. And I suppose I'm quite unique in like not shying away from admitting that I am a campaigning journalist, and that like I produce investigations and films and reports with outcomes in mind. I want things to change, right? It's not everyone's style, but I generate work because I want things to change, right? I'm looking into stories that are under discussed and issues that need urgent action because I want discussion and urgent action. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I feel like the production of stories like yours and a lot of the other things that are happening now on GB News, which I think is a quite an interesting kind of breath of fresh air. It does have certain aspects of kind of more Fox Newsy, Sky Newsy type production, but there is quite a lot of stuff on GB News that is pretty much unprecedented in the UK. Because while I was there, I was essentially reliant on murky, strange alternative media. I mean, nothing that was produced by the mainstream kind of like network type
Sure.
television had any sort of. It was absolutely pure propaganda for progressivism, and you'd have to go, I don't know, on YouTube or other places, Odyssey, to find anything that was remotely tied to reality. So I think that's a good change. Yeah, I mean, what do you make of the GB News revolution? Do you see any traction, any kind of scale that this type of media is getting?
Well, I mean, they employ me, so of course I'm enormously positive about them. Well, look, GB News is the first entry into the live television market for over 30 years, right, in Britain. So I think that very clearly depicts the issue that you're describing, the fact that there is a sort of blobby similarity among the mainstream media outlets that all kind of carry similar analysis and similar coverage. And I think an enormous chunk of the population feel undersupplied in terms of the issues that they care about. And it's my motivation, and I think the channel's wider motivation, is to create content that appeals to the largest portion of the population that feels as though the issues they care about aren't being discussed elsewhere. So the issues that I think are really relevant in that space are crime, immigration, security, huge social trends. I think these are areas where you find like a massive gap between analysis and proper investigation played by other mainstream outlets and what people actually want to learn about, want to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, mainstream outlets do touch on kind of these third rail subjects, but it's only if you have something like, I don't know, Question Time, and you have one person who's among five progressives, who's the like designated scapegoat for whatever, and then they extract different clips from the conversation and essentially kind of don't let the person speak up. And there's also, I mean, if you can have a multifaceted conversation if there's one guy who's the fall guy for whatever subject you get. But yeah, it's a kind of a charade.
Well, the way to get around that, I think this is an area where like the conservative side or the right in general in Britain and to some extent Europe has struggled more broadly, is that we are relying on taking over institutions that already exist to get our message across, and we're not building our own institutions. Or like new media platforms that promote commentary and coverage of issues that matter. That's how you win, right? Not by just trying to get a new commentator at the BBC who might share some opinions with other people, because you'll be overwhelmed by the prevailing liberal wind that exists elsewhere. You need to create your own institutions. You need to build your own standards, your own places to.
Yeah, I think that's That's the ticket. And I know people who are currently promoting books and trying to get obviously their numbers up in terms of book sales, who refuse to go on even on the the largest platform, mainstream television, because they know that they will be treated potentially in a way that's kind of abusive to their message, or they're set up to be the fall guy. So yeah, I think that's a very good thing, because obviously this means that they have alternatives. They still want to promote their books, they want to have sales, and now they can maybe promote them on GBNews or some other place that has scale. A lot of alternative media, not even like broadcast television, just like different podcasts, different
Mhm.
magazines now. There's I Am 7076 coming out of the UK as
Sure,
well. I mean, there's
sure.
lots of little, little to medium sized things as well, which build up and have energy of their own. So, yeah, I think this is very positive, and it might not be extremely visible, as visible as the BBC or NPR or things like that, and doesn't have that legacy air about it, but it's quite effective if you look at the scale of it at this point.
Hmm. I remember Tucker Carlson. I remember listening to something he said about maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. He said, if I was a 22-year-old fresh out of college graduate in the US, what would I do today? And I think he said something like, I would start a podcast, or like I just move to the rural New England and start a
Genius.
podcast. Yeah, which is hey, which is kind of what he's done anyway recently. But like, yeah, trying to latch onto the organizations that already exist. I think it's a project that's doomed to failure. So create
Yeah.
your own. So I don't want to repeat myself, but you know what I mean. Create your own. I'm happy to repeat myself. If someone listening to this hears the message and suddenly gets very agitated and has an urge to generate their own platform. But yes, build our own institutions, people.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of impetus to end this on, but not before I ask you the last question, the question that everyone gets, about a
Yeah.
thinker. This could be any sort of thinker, who has been influential in your view of the world, and that you think people should read more of or know about, or yeah, just be familiar with.
Can I pick two? Is that all right?
Sure,
All
please.
right, great. Well, so in terms of reading, I think the writer and philosopher Nina Power is fantastic. And she wrote a book last year called What Do Men Want, which I read and loved, and I spoke with her about. And, I think your question is about them being underrated. I think that book is hugely underrated. And I think it's very almost frustrating that she wrote the book just before the rise of Andrew Tate, right? And these sudden conversations about toxic masculinity, so-called toxic masculinity, oh my God, kind of like pushing themselves to the front of the like international consciousness and the culture. But so many answers to questions posed by that discussion are found in that book and her wider work, which I recommend widely to all. I use it almost as kind of a regular. I'm recommending that book more than I am any other at the moment because of this kind of Tate-related chat. Why might young men be agitating towards him? Hey, it's a whole conversation for another time. But right, within Nina Power's work, you will find some answers. And then, kind of slightly off the beaten track, I suppose, a very separate, a musician, a music producer I listen to almost every day, called A.G. Cook. There was a sadly now passed writer, philosopher, all round very interesting man called Mark Fisher, who used to have a music blog called K-Punk, which I read a bit towards the end of his life when I was still quite young. And he wrote a lot about so-called hauntology, this sensation derived from French philosopher Jacques Derrida, about the idea that you're haunted by possible futures that you can't achieve because capitalism and the inevitability of capitalism means that you can't imagine an alternative. Capitalism is so ingrained in our culture, etc., etc. I'm not sure I believe with the wider philosophy he puts in, but he makes an argument which I think is totally convincing, which is that this drive of there's only one vision for life and only one vision for culture prevents the arrival of new ideas and new thinking and, crucially, new music. And so, at the time he was writing, Amy Winehouse was huge. She sounded like the 1950s. Bands like the Arctic Monkeys were huge. They literally sound like the 1980s. In fact, he says that when he first listened to I bet that you look good on the dance floor by the Arctic Monkeys. He thought it was from 1984. And so we revive zombie forms of music, in his words, and we don't create anything new. And the reason why I like A.G. Cook is because he makes music that sounds the way you feel, and that he is making music for 2023, not repackaging funk like Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars, not giving me 70s disco in 2022 HD headphones. I get new music that sounds like the age I live in with A.G. Cook, and so listen to him. See
I
what you
know
think.
that's an excellent recommendation. I was just thinking about Mark Ronson just a second before you mentioned him. I was like, yeah, just like Mark Ronson.
I don't like Mark Ronson very much. I think you can tell he makes me very upset.
Yeah, I mean that was a tone of for almost an entire decade. I mean, he's definitely influential. But yeah, that's just like reviving and defibrillating all sorts of music from every age. I mean, he's very much a remixer.
He's not moved the culture forward one step, and his music has tens of billions of plays. So
Yeah, there's
there
a,
you
I
go.
don't know where I've heard this, but I think it's an interesting observation that if you see a picture from the 1970s, you can pretty much through the clothing and how people carry themselves know,
Mm,
okay, this is from about 1970. Same with the 50s. Nowadays, it's very murky. I mean, I guess you
mhm.
could tell by the quality of the HD,
Sure.
but it's pretty hard just because we are in this kind of remix age, and I mean most Zoomers look like they're from the 90s now.
Yeah.
There's flared pants again, pretty much 70s as well. I mean, it would
Yeah.
really much depends which street corner you take a picture of, but it doesn't really. And a lot of essentially the hardware that we use, from cars to just like the basic technologies of living, has not changed much. I mean, maybe you could date people through like the actual, the generation of phone they're holding in their hands, but if they might, put it down to take the picture, it's going to be very hard. So yeah, I'm happy that you've recommended someone who maybe bucks this trend because it seems so all consuming.
Yeah. I seek it out in all like culture I consume. I seek anyone who pushes the culture forward. I don't want to see people wearing low-rise jeans like they're bringing back Y2K anymore. I want to see
Yeah, me
something new.
neither. I'm too old
Yeah.
for low-rise jeans.
Well, yeah, East London has changed a little bit since your time. I think it's 2001 again. It's not
Oh
good.
yeah.
It's not good.
Nice. Well, yeah, I mean that's in a way interesting to hear. I'm actually going to visit East London. I don't know if East London, but London in a few months. I've just been invited to speak at NatCon. So
Oh, great.
yeah, I'll be there again, 6 months pregnant. So it's gonna be interesting. Yeah, I mean yeah, that's a great recommendation. Thank you so much for coming on. And do you have any direction that you want to point people into? I mean, obviously the documentary, I'll link that in the show notes, but any other of your work or links?
Just message me on Twitter. I pretty much respond to every DM as long as they're not insane. So I can point you towards all the interesting work they might be wanting to chase after that. But I work full time for GB News. If that's where my work is now. I used to write for the Mail, Spectator, the Critic. Still write for the Critic sometimes, but I'm a broadcaster now. And if they want to catch up, I'm Charlie Peters on Twitter, and they'll see everything there.
Excellent, excellent. I'll link that in the show notes. So thank you so much, Charlie, for coming on and for all the work you do. I mean, more power to you. And yeah, hopefully we'll hear more and maybe more uplifting things from your directions too, though I don't expect it. But yeah, more uplifting in their effect rather than necessarily the message that you're conveying. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Keep the faith. Cheers.